Coming up on this edition of The Climate Show, we welcome back Climate Show regular contributor John Cook. He's going to be talking about those horrific bushfires in Australia, as well as all those record temperatures that have been set. Plus, we look at Obama's inauguration speech, the special mention of climate change in there. Also, media coverage of climate change over the past year. Has it increased or decreased? Plus, unfortunately, what Boris Johnson's been saying. Also, Jason Box's dark snow project. We look at sea level rise, as well as perhaps a possible solution to the increasing carbon in the atmosphere. Magic dust. Yes, that is all coming up on this edition of The Climate Show. This episode of The Climate Show is brought to you by hot-topic.co.nz, cyblogs.co.nz, skepticalscience.com, scoop.co.nz, and idealog.co.nz.
We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations.
What good is a drop in the ocean? What good is a drop in the ocean?
And the Climate Show starts now. Welcome to the Climate Show, episode number 32, recording the 23rd of January 2013. My name is Glenn Williams, with you here in London, United Kingdom, where it's been snowing this week. It's been very, very cold, and I seem to have caught a cold as well. I seem to be a petri dish here in London over the past few months. If it's going, I'm catching it at the moment, unfortunately. So I hope my voice holds up for the better part of the show. But of course, I'm not alone. I have Gareth Ronaldon, my co-host, with me. He's in Waipara, North Canterbury. And also today, a special guest who's going to hang out for the show. Particularly, we're getting him on because of the crazy bushfires and extreme heat records that have been set in Australia. It is John Cook from skeptical.science.com. Now you can check out all the show notes. They will be up at theclimateshow.com. You can basically follow along with the show there, and the show notes will also be up at hot-topic.co.nz. It just depends on where you prefer to join in the conversation there. We also have the Facebook page, facebook.com/The Climate Show, twitter.com/The Climate Show, as well as our Google Plus page. The show comes in two flavours. It is in audio and video. So let's launch into this news, John, with, of course, of these Australian bushfires and temperature records that have been set. Boy, they've been blowing away all kinds of records, haven't they?
Yeah, what's been amazing about the Australian heatwave is well, two really aspects to it. Is firstly just how long this heatwave has lasted, and the extent of it, just how much of Australia it's covering. So I grabbed a picture from the Bureau of Meteorology that I hope you can put up, Glenn. And what it shows is just the first 2 weeks of 2013, and over 70% of the continent is hotter than 42 degrees Celsius. So
wow.
It's just extraordinary that the heat wave has just covered such a broad area.
That's extraordinary. Now, didn't they have to add another colour into the predicted temperature maps because it was just off the chart?
Well, yeah, they had to add this purple colour for temperatures over 50 degrees Celsius because the projections were predicting that, and they'd never got that hot before. And it was quite interesting that the fact that the Australian temperature map had this new colour that just went viral all over the world, and even American mainstream media were talking about that. And I heard from one guy at the Bureau of Meteorology who knew the technician who made this change to the map, and he was just a quiet guy who worked in the office, and he was freaking out that the whole world was talking about this new little purple colour that he'd added to his temperature map.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a real visual kind of representation that people can sort of really understand about how extreme the situation is there in Australia. What's actually happening now? Is it starting to cool down a bit?
Yes, it's improved. The bushfires are still raging across the country, and when it gets this hot, those are ripe conditions for bushfires. So that's why we've been seeing our bushfires all over the country. we've been a bit lucky in Brisbane. We haven't got the worst of it. So our temperatures where I live have been about mid 30 degrees, which is actually fairly normal for Brisbane. So apart from one day, we actually went to water park with the family, and we came home with boils on our feet from walking around on the hot concrete.
Wow.
But generally, it's really been the southern states and particularly South Australia that has caught the worst of it. And I guess a good indication of it is the fact that I think for the national average, the average over the whole country, for 11 days straight, it's been over 38 degrees.
So give us some stats on sort of how intense, as you say, that it actually has been. You know, what sort of temperatures are we talking about?
Well, the hottest it got was on the 7th of January, a couple of weeks ago, and the national maximum average was 40.33 degrees. So that averaged over the whole continent was over 40 degrees, and that's the hottest day on record.
So lots of individual records broken as well.
Yeah, there was a number of places recorded 49 degrees. There was one place it's a funny sounding town. I can never remember how to pronounce it, but they were so hot that after midday, the petrol station stopped serving our customers because the petrol vaporized when people tried to put it in their car.
Wow.
It's kind of a maybe it's the way of the climate fighting back, trying to get less fossil fuels in cars.
Which is it's actually sort of opposite to something I saw on the news yesterday about somewhere in Europe. It's so cold that that water was freezing in the air when you throw a cup of water out into the air, it froze. So that's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum right now.
Yeah, we're envying you at the moment.
Yeah, sure.
I'd much rather swap your weather for ours.
So have the experts, have they worked out why, in particular, now these extreme record temperatures are being set?
Well, they're really talking about two contributing factors on why the heat wave has been so intense and lasted so long. One of the contributors is the fact that the Australian monsoon season is several weeks late. So what that means is rather than having rain and cloud cover cooling the north of the country, what we're getting instead is it's just been a lack of rain, a lack of cloud cover, and this hot, dry air mass has built up in the middle of the country and then expanded across the continent.
So let's just explain what the monsoon is, John. Basically, the interior of the continent gets so hot that the air rises, the hot air rises, as it always does, and it pulls in the moisture-laden air from off the Indian Ocean, and that comes in over the Northern Territory and eventually works its way across the continent. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, that sounds about right. And what there's a great article, I think Glenn was just showing a screenshot of it, where some Australian climate scientists are explaining what's contributing to the heat wave. And the other contributor is the fact that there's just more heat in our climate system. So any weather that we experience now is happening in a climate system that's 1 degree warmer than it was a century ago.
Right.
So because of this all this extra heat in the system, we're just seeing a shift in the distribution of temperatures. It's just all like if you imagine like a distribution of heat, it's just shifting across towards hotter temperatures. So because of that, we're seeing the ratio of record heats to record colds is now, I think, for daytime maximum temperatures, the ratio is like 3 to 1. We're seeing 3 times as many record heat waves. And for nighttime temperatures, the ratio is 5 to 1. So we're seeing 5 times as many record hot nights compared to days, compared to record cold nights.
And so, Gareth, I understand that you've been enjoying these bushfires kind of at the expense of Australia with some amazing sunsets in New Zealand.
Yes, there have been some amazing sunsets. Mind you, I have to say that in my little bit of New Zealand, which is the east coast of the South Island, we've been getting some hot, dry winds. So we've had days in the 30s, which is not terribly unusual for Canterbury, but it's been we do get bushfires in those circumstances, and there've been a number of nothing on the scale that we see in Australia at the moment, but still, a bushfire is a bushfire, and when it comes roaring through a paddock and takes out your house, then you're going to be annoyed by or hurt by it just the same. And the thing that struck me about the Australian heatwave was, as John's been talking about the shifts in probabilities of various temperatures, but the heatwave was record-breaking in three respects. It was the intensity of the heat wave, so it was hotter than ever before. It was the duration of the heat wave. In other words, it lasted longer than ever before. I think you mentioned 11 days, John, of record average, continental average maximum temperatures. And I think the previous time it had gone over 39 degrees Celsius, it was only 4 days in a row. So you're looking at almost getting three times the duration. And then the other thing was just the simple extent, duration, intensity, and extent. This massive dome of hot air was covering the whole of Australia. Absolutely staggering.
Yeah, and we've got a graphical sort of representation as well of when I say graphical, it's a satellite photo, isn't it, of Australia, of those burning fires.
That's right. Yeah. So NASA have published this photo, a nighttime photo of Australia, and so normally you'll just see the night lights around the capital cities, but here the whole interior of Western Australia is lit up. And NASA actually have an interesting interactive graphic, and hopefully you guys can post a link to it, where you can just drag across the map of Australia, and it shows you an image of all the bushfire scars. There we go. So it just shows all the scarring across Australia from the bushfires, and you can see that all the matchup of areas that are lit up at night, and then that are scarred afterwards.
All right, and it looks like we've got Gareth back. Might have noticed he just dropped off and went silent just before. Apparently because we're talking about all these heat waves and whatnot. He had a mini heat wave on his laptop here, Gareth. You all right now? What's going on?
Well, I don't know. I have to put my laptop in the freezer. It just doesn't like these hot temperatures. Never mind. The next story that I wanted to draw attention to kind of builds on John's Tales of Australian Heat, and that was a recent paper from Potsdam, from the Potsdam Institute, finding that global warming has increased monthly heat records worldwide by a factor of 5. Now, what the authors looked at month-long periods and determined whether they fell into records, and then analysed the statistics of it all. And what they say, one interesting thing which I picked out of the press release for the project was that if the globe continues to warm at its present rate, the number of new monthly records will be 12 times as high in 30 years as it would be without climate change. Now, that doesn't mean there are going to be 12 times more hot summers in Europe than today. It's actually worse than that, points out Kumu, the lead author, because for new records to be set in the 2040s, they'll actually have to be hotter than records set in the 2020s and 2030s, which will already be hotter than anything we've experienced to date. So, John, I'm afraid that's not terribly good news for Australia, because you're setting those records now, and if you're going to be getting 12 times as many records in 30 years' time, life is going to be pretty unattractive in continental Australia, I'd have thought.
Yeah, I mean, well, we won't be Robinson Crusoe. It's going to be all over the world. And this study isn't new either. I mean, there's been similar studies looking at American temperatures and projecting it into the future, and the ratio of record heat waves to record cold snaps, and similar thing, the ratio just increases dramatically and quite alarmingly.
Yes, it's not a good outlook. So what are we going to do to stop it, Glenn? You've picked up some stories from really hot story today from Greenpeace report.
Yes, indeed. Well, this is being reported on RTCC. A new report commissioned by Greenpeace says the world could be locked into dangerous levels of global warming if 14 planned fossil fuel projects get the go-aheads. Yes, the projects in this report by Greenpeace, the report's called Point of No Return, include the expansion of Indonesian and Australian coal exports, a tripling of production from the Canadian tar sands, and extensive offshore drilling in Brazilian waters. All in all, they say that 6,340 million tonnes of CO2 a year by 2020, that is more than the total output of the US. So that is, of course, if all these projects indeed go ahead. The link to this full report is in the show notes. Well worth a read. There's lots of good graphics in there, and we do like some good graphics. But well, if these projects go ahead, it's quite the opposite to the direction of where we should be headed, right?
There is a terrible disconnect between what we understand about what we're doing to the climate system and what we think is likely to happen, not 100 years' time, but over the coming decades. And Australia's seat is one very good example of what we might expect to see more of. A terrible disconnect between that understanding of the climate system, which has been incredibly hard won by the scientific establishment around the world, and what business people and politicians are apparently happy to continue to do.
Yeah.
I mean, Australia and Western China, the coal resources in those two places alone are enough to get us even deeper into trouble than we are already. And actually, if you can scroll down a bit, Glenn, I think in the next page or two, there's a little graph that shows what we can avoid. So we're at the first sort of yellow arrow, or orangey yellow arrow, shows where we are today. That's at annual emissions of about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And we've really got to get things turning downwards in the next few years, next 3 years or so, to have a 75% chance to stay below a 2 degrees Celsius warming. If we allow ourselves a bit longer, we can sort of still cut, but it'll have to be an even steeper cut than the 5% per annum that they were saying is necessary to give ourselves a 75% chance. We'll do it a bit longer. We've then got a 50% chance to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. But what this Greenpeace report is basically saying, if we go ahead with these 14 coal and oil shale projects, we'll effectively lock ourselves into a route that takes us to 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. Now they're basing
unthinkable. It's unthinkable. I mean, 2 degrees is generally really unthinkable as well, but 5 to 6, I mean, that's catastrophic.
What really worries me, Glenn, and I had to do a talk at the weekend for a New Zealand group called the Coal Action Network, Aotearoa.
Yeah.
And they're campaigning to keep coal in the ground in New Zealand. And, if we carry on taking coal out and burning it, we are just committing civilizational suicide, really. And we've got to find a way to get ourselves off it. And what this Greenpeace report has done is identify 14 major projects, which, each one of them, if we could stop doing those, would take us a long way towards not solving the climate crisis, because we are already committed to a lot of damaging warming, but at least perhaps preventing the really bad stuff that'll happen if we get up to 5 or 6 degrees of warming.
One of those projects that are listed in the Greenpeace report is actually Queensland. So, because we have a lot of planned mines that are getting constructed at the moment, and the amount of coal that Queensland is planning to export is rather mind-boggling. I think it was Greenpeace that produced a report a few months ago, just examining the amount of coal coming out of Queensland, and it was more than most countries. I think we were ranked in like the top 20 if you include just countries and the amount of fossil fuel that they're producing, and just these handful of mines. We're up there in the mix. But what this report Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, is anyone in Australia really talking about the sort of civilizational, or rather the sort of carbon consequences of what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Clive Hamilton is one of the strongest voices on this, and Grant Redfern has written a number of posts just wondering why this isn't part of the conversation in Australia. That we're talking about carbon tax, which is great. It's great that Australia has a carbon tax, and we're talking about reducing our CO2 emissions. But the fact that Australia and Queensland in particular is exporting so much coal is not really part of the conversation, and it needs to be.
Well, that's and that follows on quite nicely to this other story on RTCC, that media coverage of climate change in North America, in the US, in 2012 fell by 2%. And of course, this is despite all the big major weather events, the big drought, of course, that was happening in the US, and Hurricane Sandy, and yet coverage of climate change fell by 2%. And they're also saying on RTCC that it doesn't look all that promising for 2013 either, when you look at the White House's We the People online petition website. That's where people can post petitions about, sort of the big issues of the year and try to get people and public and political support behind them. But they've got things on there like keep Piers Morgan in the USA, direct the United States Mint to make a single platinum $1 trillion coin, end the war on coal, end the job-killing policies of the EPA, make the metric system standard in the US. So, there's nothing to climate change related there apart from the end the war on coal. But that's going in the opposite direction, of course, where we want it. So the conversation still isn't really happening in the US. And as you say, John, it's not exactly happening in the right places in Australia either.
No, I mean, well, in Australia there is a fair amount of talk because the carbon tax is now government policy. So there's a lot of talk about that, and there's a lot of misinformation coming from the Murdoch press. But yeah, talking about coal exports is kind of that dirty little secret that does need to be more prominent.
Okay.
That's interesting, that article you talked about and talking about the different petitions, because what I found amusing was some of the things that beat climate change.
Yeah.
One was that the US government build a Star Trek Enterprise spaceship.
Yeah.
Which is apparently a higher priority amongst the American public.
Yeah, apparently so.
And reholding the federal election got 10 times the amount of signatures than climate change did.
Yeah, and they apparently it was rejected. The Death Star was rejected by the US government.
It was, I have to say, and rather nicely. They did do it rather well, I thought. But, Obama has had his inauguration, and he said the words,
We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations. Some may still deny the overwhelming judgment of science, but none can avoid the devastating impact of raging fires and crippling drought and more powerful storms. The path towards sustainable energy sources will be long and sometimes difficult. But America cannot resist this transition.
So that was Obama there, obviously, with his talk there on climate change during the inauguration. And perhaps maybe, I mean, he was, obviously his speech is specifically about the US, but maybe there was a little nod to the situation currently in Australia with the bushfires there as well. John, did you take that he was perhaps talking about Australia?
Well, he's probably more talking about the bushfires that America experienced in 2012. So, I mean, America really experienced the whole gamut of extreme climate impacts over the last 12 months. I think that's part of the driver of why he's brought up the issue now.
Yeah. And at the same time, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says his top hopes for 2013 are to reach a new agreement on climate change, as well as urgently end the increasing deadly war in Syria as well. But he put climate change at basically at the top of his agenda. So it seems the president and the head of the UN singing from the same song sheet, Gareth.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, but it's easy for Ban Ki-moon to say things like that. Those are the sorts of things really that the UN Secretary General has to say. He isn't the guy who's going to decide what actually happens. That will be the American political process, and to a greater or lesser extent, the equivalent in China. And yeah, I'll add India in there as well. But unless those 2 or 3 nations really take this problem seriously and really start to make very, very serious and very, very urgent cuts, we are on the highway to hell. There's little doubt about that.
So isn't that the issue? I mean, so Obama could set his agenda for the next 4 years. He doesn't need to be re-elected, and that's probably why he's come out with in his inauguration with these very specific goals. Although still, it's sort of it's rhetoric rather than exactly goals. So he's come out obviously with a bit of an agenda, but as you say, it doesn't matter necessarily if he doesn't bring China with him. And as far as I know, he hasn't talked to the new leadership in China, and they have their own internal politics and internal goals as well. And as you say, it's all for nothing if those big nations aren't all on the journey together, right?
Equally, it's all for nothing if he can't bring his sort of political system with him too, because you've got a situation where the Republicans have basically been stymieing any sort of action for the last 3 years, and it's difficult to see whether they're going to change that policy at all. They just seem committed to throw themselves, they've narrowly avoided a fiscal cliff, but they seem determined to throw themselves off a climate cliff, and that seems to be because half of them don't believe it exists.
Yeah.
Well, tell that to the parachute.
All right. Well, we'll be following obviously very closely on the Climate Show, what the specifics actually will be from Obama and his administration, and also Ban Ki-moon. Because it's all very well to say these things, but what will the actual action be? And we'll be following that very closely here on the show. Now, this next one, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I thought it's worth it just seeing I am here in London. A bit of a dispatch from London. Shock horror. Boris Johnson says something really, really stupid. He says this week's snow in London casts doubt on climate science. And of course, as Leo Hickman points out in his article on The Guardian, that he is only trolling and he's done this sort of thing before. But he points out that it does actually matter because he could be the Prime Minister one day. He says that he doesn't necessarily want to go for Prime Minister, but he seems to be putting himself there in front of the Conservatives and saying, hey, I could be your guy in the future. So it does matter when someone in this kind of position says something really stupid like this. Is Boris Johnson on your radar in there in Australia? I mean, he's a mayor, for goodness sake, but he seems to be a worldwide superstar. What do you think, John?
Well, we hadn't heard of him until this article, so he wasn't on my radar at all. But he is now. So, I mean, I read that article of his and with great interest and many raised eyebrows. And what really jumped out at me in it, I mean, there was all the silliness about confusing weather with climate and not really understanding why England is having these record snowstorms at the moment. But there was one little statement in there that jumped out at me, was where he said, well, the climate scientists may say one thing, but I know a few scientists who say otherwise. Yeah. And he's basically portraying this idea that there's half the scientists are saying there's climate change, and the other half are saying that there's nothing to worry about. And it's really a false picture, and it's a false picture that you get all the time from people who deny the scientific consensus, because that's what we have. We have 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. So when he says, I have a few climate scientists that say there's no problem, they are really just a few out of the whole overwhelming majority of scientists who agree about climate change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Well, I'm now going to make Glenn very unhappy, because I'm going to mention two words that should never be mentioned in Glenn's presence, and those words are Ken Ring.
Oh.
And the reason I'm
No.
And the reason I'm mentioning those two words is that Boris, in his wonderful article, and I should say, for those of you who are listening in black and white, Boris Johnson is well known in Britain for being a bit of a political buffoon and a bit of a political clown. He always was, he still is, and I think he probably always will be. But
he's an attention seeker.
And he performs.
Yeah.
He performs. That's how he gets himself out.
And
and
he's also, I have to say, he's done some great things for the city. I mean, he's done something very green.
The Boris bikes.
The Boris bikes.
The Boris bikes are a wonderful thing.
A brilliant
These
thing.
are bikes that you can.
Yeah.
They're sort of like Amsterdam, John.
I've
He's
got
turning London into Amsterdam. You can cycle anywhere.
There's bikes just outside the apartment here, and I subscribe to them. They've just doubled the price of them, for goodness sake, from £45 per year to 90. But I managed to get in just before they did that. So it's a very good deal. Go from place to place. You pay nothing extra if you're only using them for 30 minutes. It's a really good scheme, and it's a very green scheme. So it's a shame that he does these things, but he also comes out with ridiculous statements like this. But carry on, Gareth.
Yes. So the reason I mentioned Ken Ring is that in his article, which, as Leo Heckman points out in The Guardian, is a bit of a sop to the right wing of the Conservative Party, Boris chooses to rely on a solar weather forecaster called Piers Corbyn. Now, Piers Corbyn is one of the more, well, how shall I put this without getting sued? One of the more extreme climate deniers. He doesn't believe in the greenhouse effect. He thinks that's nonsense. He thinks that all weather is driven by events on the sun. And he issues these almost impenetrable forecasts of extreme weather around the world. And you never hear when he gets it wrong, which is about 90 to 99% of the time. But you do hear it when he's got something that might be half right, which is, of course, exactly the technique that astrologer Ken Ring uses in predicting the weather for Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Boris should choose to rely on a guy who's no better than an astrologer and sets him up as somehow equivalent to the science edifice that has got us where we are today in terms of our knowledge of the climate. Politicians, on the whole, tend to be interested only in the next job or their promotion, and Boris, I think, believes the press that he's been getting. So
yeah.
He thinks he might be the next. He's got a shot at being the next prime minister. So this sort of nonsense is an attempt to play to that wing of the British Conservative Party which hates wind farms. Doesn't want to do anything about climate change because it exists. It's a chunk of politics in Britain, just like it's a chunk of politics in Australia.
Exactly. Hey, we've already talked about Boris Johnson way too much, and you mentioned that other guy as well. What happened? Hey, let's talk about jobs, people with jobs. A previous climate show guest. And we're always sort of talking about what he's up to because it's always interesting, is Jason Box, and he's got a new job.
Yes, he has. He's got his perfect job. He's gone to work in Copenhagen as a professor, and he's basically in charge of going to Greenland a lot, which is what he spent most of his career doing. So John and I both ran recently posts publicising his latest project, which is the first crowd-funded Greenland expedition. John, do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, he's teamed up with Peter Sinclair, who runs the Climate Cock of the Weeks videos, which are these excellent YouTube videos. And he's just gotten so amazingly good over the last few years in the quality of the videos he produces on a regular basis. And so what they're planning to do is Jason wants to go to Greenland to do research into what's causing the melting of or what's contributing to the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And like we know that the surface temperature and ocean warming are contributing to the melting sea ice. But one intriguing idea that Jason has is that soot is also having an effect, and that when you have bushfires In fact, we were just talking about the bushfires in America. It's possible that the soot from those bushfires are actually blowing across onto the Greenland ice sheet. It darkens the ice sheet, which means that the ice sheet then absorbs more sunlight, causing warming, which further melts the ice sheet. And so last summer in Greenland, they had a record amount of ice melt, to the point where I think there's this photo from NASA that showed something like 97 or 100% of the ice sheet was melting at this one point in time, which was the most that they'd ever had at one particular instant. And so Jason's research is he wants to investigate, take samples of the ice sheet and look at the soot. Can he track where the soot came from? And Peter Sinclair wants to go with him and video the research project. Was that a good sum up,
Peter Sinclair?
Gareth?
Yeah, that's a very good summit, and I think this Peter Sinclair chap is having far too much fun, because if he gets to go to Greenland with Jason Box, he'll be doing something that I would like to do. But you know, last summer last North American summer, he went off to glaciers with Maury Pelto in the Cascades. So, you know, I'm getting heartily jealous of all this. Maybe I'll have to see if we can get a trip to Antarctica, John. You and we need to go to Antarctica immediately.
Isn't there some Pacific island that we should be going to?
Yeah, well, they're still there. Probably right. But no, I'd just like to say that Jason's Dark Snow project is an extremely interesting one, and it's not terribly expensive. So if you can chip some money in, the web link will be in the show notes. Do go along and, you know, stick him a $5 or whatever you happen to have spare, because I think they're about halfway there, aren't they, John?
I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe not that far yet, but yeah. I mean, that's the most important thing that I really failed to mention, was the fact that they're actually crowdsourcing this, which is quite unique about this project. They're crowdfunding it. Whether the project happens or not will depend on whether they can get enough donations. So Jason has set up the darksnowproject.org website, and people can just donate through there. And if they get enough donations, then they'll be able to go ahead with the research.
So their goal is $150,000. They're currently at $64,000. So that's great. A lot of people have been putting their money where their mouth is, really, haven't they? That's fantastic. So darksnowproject.org, as you say, is the place to head, and will also be in the show notes. And also, I should mention that Jason, if you're going to be in the Washington area at the end of January, Jason Box will be speaking at the Climate Desk Live, which is a series of talks hosted by the climatedesk.org, or just climatedesk.org, that they have been running in Washington. I think before the election they were talking to politicians as well, but he's going to be talking about Greenland. Can Greenland be saved is the question. They're saying the writing on the wall: Greenland is melting and faster than expected due to climate change. If it fully melts, it will raise global sea levels by 7 meters, leading to even more dramatic loss of coastal land around the world, including in many major cities. The question is not whether this is happening, but whether we're too late to stop it. So he will be talking about that. And I assume, because it's a Climate Desk Live, that it will also be streamed as well. They were certainly streaming their other events live online as well. So that is worth checking out. You can also attend it if you're in the Washington area. So moving along now, Gareth, you've got some stories about sea level rise.
Yes, I wanted to throw these stories in because they make a sort of natural sequence. And one particular paper that crossed my desk, or rather crossed my Firefox tabs in the last week or two, basically a group of scientists have looked at the relationship between historical or paleoclimate CO2 levels and plotted where they are in relation to the sea level at the time. Now, that's a pretty complex thing to do, but they have plotted, I think, a couple of thousand of these relationships, and they looked at times in ice ages when there was only 180 parts per million of CO2, and times when the planet was virtually ice-free and CO2 was 1,000 parts per million. And what they've done is they've found that there's a very strong relationship between CO2 increase and sea level rise. But, and this is the killer part, that when you get to around about 400 to 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, sea level is usually around 24 meters above present levels. Okay, now that's a probabilistic estimate, so they say that's at 68% confidence limits, and they give pretty wide error bars, so they could be 24 plus 7 or minus 15 meters above present levels. But the bottom line to that is if we stabilize our atmospheric CO2 at current levels, because we're currently at 394 parts per million, we are committed in the long term to a sea level rise of the order of 20 meters. Now, when we talk about sea level rise, and we've talked about it on the show many times, we're often talking about, is it going to be a meter by 2100? Is it going to be 2 meters? You know, we get worried about that because that's pretty dramatic. But what this new study is suggesting is that the longer term, when the ice sheet can catch up with the warming of the atmosphere, we're committing ourselves to very much higher sea levels. 20 meters of sea level rise for us in the South Island of New Zealand basically turns Christchurch back into a swamp. The Banks Peninsula, which once was an island, will be an island again. It's a pretty dramatic change. I don't know, what would 24 meters do to Brisbane, John?
Well, me personally, our house is, I think I looked it up during the Brisbane floods a few years ago, and where our house is about 15 meters above sea level rise. So most of Brisbane, well, we're a river city, so Brisbane would be pretty much wiped off the map. And in fact, I think according to current circumstances, of course, this is it would be a lot different hundreds of years into the future, but currently 24 meters of sea level rise would cover something like 10% of the world's population, or possibly higher.
Yeah, because of course we all like to live next to the water, and that would mean London would also be wiped off the map. You can forget about going down to the tube.
That leads me on next to a very, very good video. It's 45 minutes long, so it demands a bit of time to watch. But it's by Richard Alley, and Richard Alley is one of the leading kind of ice scientists out there, and he is talking about the relationship between ice sheets and warming and what happened. And the thing that struck me most about this, it's an excellent lecture. I highly recommend watching it if you've got any interest in ice at all. But the final section, he discusses the Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica, very close to the Pine Island Glacier, which we've talked about before. And Richard discusses the stability of these sorts of ice sheets, and he points out that there is a possibility, he doesn't know how big that possibility is, he doesn't know how long it will take to happen, but there is a possibility that something like the Thwaites Glacier could collapse on decadal to century timescales. Now, in the Thwaites Glacier alone, there's enough ice to raise sea levels by 3 meters. And it should be said at this point that during the last interglacial, which was the Eemian interglacial, 125,000 years ago, sea levels were about 6 meters above present, and half of that is thought to come from West Antarctica and half from Greenland. So there's a interesting possibility down there. But I highly recommend you view Richard Alley's lecture. It's a model of its kind.
Cool. Check that out in the show notes. Now, also something from New Scientist, that sea level rise could lead to cooler, stormier planet. A cooler planet, Gareth?
Yeah, it's the latest from Jim Hansen, and Hansen has this way of releasing the stuff that he's working on for sort of conversation beforehand. And New Scientist is picking up on something he released in the early new year. And basically Hansen's thesis is that if you get rapid sea level rise, this could destabilize ice sheets in Antarctica and cause rapid ice loss from Greenland. And basically you get armadas of ice floating around in the Southern Ocean and in the North Atlantic, and that this would be enough to reduce global warming. John, have you come across this paper? What do you think?
I guess with global warming, it's not so much the warming that's the problem, it's the climate change that's the problem. So warming is a problem, but also a dramatic cooling like that would also cause disruptions, and which would be problematic as well. And I guess if people are trying to take a rose-coloured glasses look at the fact that some global warming will be cancelled out temporarily, I think that's more than offset by all the disruption from the sea level rise that is accompanying it.
Yeah, it's a sort of pretty sort of catastrophic scenario that Hansen's considering there. But maybe something like that has happened in the past. We suspect, don't we, that a period of rapid cooling as the Earth was warming out of the last ice age, which is called the Younger Dryas period, was caused by the collapse of an ice sheet, basically causing the climate to flip into a cool state for 1,000 years or so.
And Gareth, you've been feeling a little bit gloomy over there at Hot Topic as well.
Yeah, well, I sort of did the 5-minute version, which I call it the Gore synthesis, because I thought that might annoy a few people who might think it was about Al Gore. But basically, I sat down to do a talk for this collection network, Aotearoa, that I mentioned before. And they wanted to know, where are we now? Where are we heading? What do we need to do? And as I sat down and considered all the extreme weather and where the lack of action, and the fact that people like the World Bank and the International Energy Agency are suggesting we're on a trajectory to 4 degrees, and now we have this new Greenpeace report pointing out 14 dirty energy projects that sort of are pointing us towards 5 and 6 degrees. I just got very gloomy. How on earth do you turn all this stuff around?
Yeah.
I was talking to people who are involved in politics, and what we have to do is give our politicians the balls to do something, because they're not going to do it on their own. There's too much vested interests. You can see it in America, you can see it in Australia, you can see it in New Zealand. The corporate lobbyists don't want us to be doing these things because it would be inconvenient. And sadly, what will be really inconvenient will be the sort of dramatic climate change that looks increasingly certain to happen.
Yeah, it would be fair to say that there's been, in the past 20 to 30 years, there's been some tinkering around the edges, right? Small things have come out of talks, emissions trading schemes, all this tinkering stuff, but none of it has actually had a real world or made a real world difference, has it? It's nothing. We've gone backwards. We have not gone forwards at all.
Emissions continue to rise at an amazing rate. Whether it's exponential or not, you could argue, but we are on the wrong trajectory, and that's very bad news after 20 odd years of UN-led attempts to broker emissions reductions.
But Gareth, I have a solution, and it involves magic dust. And that means we are moving into the final segment of the show, the many-part solution, example of solutions, research, or green tech. Now, this was reported that sprinkling billions of tons of mineral dust across the oceans, yes, this magic dust, could quickly remove vast quantities of climate warming carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This study suggests that the geoengineering technique would also offset the acidification of the oceans and could be targeted at endangered coral reefs. But there is a downside. It would require a mining effort on the same scale as the world's coal industry, and it could and would alter the biology of the oceans. So a slight positive in there, but hang on, it's not really a solution, this at all. This is being reported in The Guardian. We'll have a link to that as well. Have you heard about this before, John?
I mean, whenever they talk about these geoengineering solutions, I always think of the metaphor that essentially it's suggesting drinking one type of poison to try to cancel out the effect of another type of poison.
Yeah.
When what we really should be doing is just stop drinking the first poison in the first place.
Yeah. And
so you just don't know what side effects can come from spilling all these minerals into the ocean and disrupting the ecosystems in the oceans, and also like how effective it can be. Like often these kind of things the effectiveness tails off quite quickly, and it doesn't have the dramatic pulling in of CO2 that they would like it to have.
It's like introducing another pest into an environment where a pest has already been released to try and control that previous pest, isn't it?
Well, we know about
Absolutely.
that in Queensland where they introduced the cane toad to try to deal with the bugs, and now the cane toads have spread all over the country, and they're a terrible pest.
If we go back to that thing about 20 meters of sea level rise at 400 parts per million, the obvious conclusion to draw, if we want sea levels to be somewhere near where we are today, we have to go below 400 parts per million. So Bill McKibben's organisation 350.org, they took the number 350 from a Jim Hansen paper, incidentally, because Jim thought that was a level of CO2 that would allow there to be ice at both ends of the planet. Now, what those sea level rise numbers suggest is we may even need to go below 350 if we're going to save large chunks of the coastline in the longer term. And the nasty thing about going beyond stabilization and taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is that the oceans have been doing us an absolutely massive favor over the last 150 years because they've been absorbing a very large part of all the CO2 that we've been putting out into the atmosphere. So at the point that we start reducing the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the oceans are going to start releasing some of that stuff that they've absorbed over the last century. And so we're going to have to work twice as hard to get atmospheric CO2 levels down. The oceans will be working against us. Now, ocean acidification is a huge problem and is probably worth dealing with even if CO2 didn't cause warming because of its impacts on ecosystems. But the geoengineering we're going to have to do to take control of atmospheric CO2 ain't going to be easy. And this story that we've just discussed can only deal with a very small part of total emissions, and it would require huge amounts of digging around in the oceans. So, we're in the position where our civilization is in the position that if we want to keep a habitable planet, I think we are almost certainly going to have to get involved in geoengineering on some scale or another. The scale that I would prefer is planting loads and loads of forests, just reforesting everywhere, covering everything with trees, because that would at least be pleasant. And we really don't want to go with ruining the world's coral reefs. But, that's the logical consequence of what we're finding out about the climate system suggests we're going to have to do that.
And more natural solution, as you say. Let's move on. Thin film solar cells, new world record for solar cell efficiency, Gareth.
Yes, that's right. That's a team in Switzerland who have been working for years on thin film solar cells on flexible polymer substrates. So these are things that can actually be quite easily fabricated, a lot easier than etching stuff on silicon, which is the sort of standard way of making a solar cell, a bit like making a computer chip. So these things, they've now got them up to 20.4% of the sunlight hitting them will be converted into electricity, which is pretty good. So it's a new record. They're now working on how they scale that up into so that stuff can be made cheap. But it's one of those things I've always thought that the most interesting stuff that's going on is in solar cell technology or in solar power technology, because there is the opportunity there for a really game-changing alteration in the way that we deal with our power systems.
Okay, and finally, UK scientists... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Gareth.
No, I was just going to say that leads very nicely on to the next story, which is British scientists trying to replicate photosynthesis. Now, I need to do a bit more research on this because the Guardian story says mimic plant energy creation to replicate photosynthesis. And they say that this is going to be done by placing tiny solar panels on microbes to harness sunlight to drive the production of hydrogen. Now, I'm sort of struggling a bit to visualize what they're talking about. But capturing solar energy is what all the world's plants do. It's what fossil fuels are, simply plants that died and turned into coal and oil. All of the world, our entire culture, the entire planetary ecosystem is built around capturing solar energy and turning it into living matter. So we ought to be smart enough these days to at least begin to mimic that process. So fascinating, and one to watch, perhaps.
Yeah, one to watch indeed. Hey, finally, actually, before we go, this is a wee fun one here from the Climate Desk. They are reporting that a group of researchers and educators based in San Jose at the State University there think climate science needs a superhero. So they've gone and created one. He's green. I suppose this is good. This is good for kids, I guess. This reminds me of something that I had as a kid when I was growing up in West Auckland. One of the concerns was in West Auckland was around conserving water, and they created a character called Robert DeFrog, drips waste water, he used to say, and he had a couple of rappers with him as well. And he used to go around visiting all the schools and rapping about drips on taps wasting water. And that stuck in my mind. I still remember it, and I still remember the rap. I won't rap for you now, but so this kind of thing is quite cool, because maybe it does stick in kids' minds and they grow up with a sort of a different view on things.
I should say that if you look at the show notes, Glenn, I've just added a link at the bottom. I want you to load that page and go to the photograph, because we do have a superhero. We have Superman. Yeah.
Make sure you scroll down, and Glenn, and get the galoshes as well.
He is, as you say, he is Scott Mandia, and he is the caped climate crusader, battling the evil forces of global warming deniers, faster than global sea rise, more powerful than a stranded polar bear, able to leap over rising seas in a single bound. There we go. We'll have to put that in the show notes as well. Maybe that's not safe for children, that one. I don't know. So that there wraps up this edition of the Climate Show. Gareth's connection, unfortunately, barely holding in there, to be fair, towards the end of the show. So sorry for the some of the poor audio quality coming from Gareth. One day they'll dig some new trenches there in North Waipara and North Canterbury and lay down some fibre. Not sure when that day will ever come. But it's been great having John along as well. John, what are you up to over the next few weeks? Got any projects, anything that anyone should know about on the go?
Well, what we've just happened this week is we've just launched or published a textbook. I guess the main purpose of it is it's like an introduction level textbook on climate change.
Great.
But we also included, and this is what's unique about the textbook, is a whole section on climate change denial and putting the whole movement and phenomenon of climate denial in perspective, explaining the rhetorical techniques and even the psychology of climate denial, and a whole chapter on debunking all of the most popular myths.
We do have an email address, by the way. It is feedback@theclimateshow.com. So if you want to send us an email, we'd love to receive it. Any thoughts, any obviously feedback or any suggestions, send it on through to feedback@theclimateshow.com. Of course, we're also on Facebook, facebook.com/theclimateshow, twitter.com/theclimateshow. Look us up on Google+. The show notes will be up at theclimateshow.com and hot-topic.co.nz. All right, there we are. That is The Climate Show for this episode. Thanks very much for joining us. Catch you next time.